What for me don't get me. Them they set jam. Emi mefa. Seke bula.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's mixed breakdown time. In case you don't know, this is Gen Z Arewa by First Class featuring Jerick the Hustler and Zlatan Ibile. So as usual, I'm going to walk you through my mix and mastering process, and hopefully you can pick up one or two things you can use in your own record. Something I typically don't do a lot to show you what the rough mix sounded like in comparison to the finished mix, and I think we should do that here today. So this is the rough mix.
Them pass Colorado, I smoke and me done best. Make them be ring, put down for casket.
And this is the finished record essentially.
Them pass I smoke and me done best. Make them be ring, put down for casket.
You can hear all the details that, was missing from the rough mix are now in your face. You can now appreciate the beauty of the record. That's why you bring your song to me for mixing and mastering. And that pass bit, that's just the clean version that you're listening to there. That's why it sounded like that. Anyways, let's jump right into this real quick. So I like to start with something called session organization when I mix and master any record. For me, session organization is simply just arranging my session in a way that is easy for me to access. And this is how I like to do it. First of all, I have one giant folder called master, as you can see. And when I open the master folder, we have the instrumental folder and we have the vocal folder. If we open the instrumental folder, we have the drums, we have the bass, and we have the melodies. When we open up the vocal folder, we have the lead vocals and the background vocals. This is basically how I like to organize my session. So let's jump right into the mix real quick. Typically when I want to mix, the first thing I do is gain staging, because we need to do that to ensure that we have decent headroom for whatever we're going to do in the mix. Let's start with this kick. I'm using the trim plugin to turn down the level to about -16.4 dB. When I say level, I'm talking about the pre-fader level, okay? That's where your focus needs to be at when you're doing gain staging. The Pro Tools mixer meters are currently set to the pre-fader. That's why if I turn this down, you can still see signal. That's how you know you are currently assessing the pre-fader level of your signal. Like I've said many times, gain staging is very important because when you have decent headroom to work with, you're going to have a very clean mix at the end of the day. And after gain staging, the next thing I usually do is use an EQ to carve out space for each instrument within the mix. For the kick, I like to do this low shelf move here. I find that this actually helps to get a much more smoother low end. I'm doing a low shelf up to 20 Hertz down to -12 dB. For me, this setting just works, And I recently started doing this beginning of this year or something like that, because I just realized that it's way better than doing a high pass. It just sounds cleaner to me, at least. Let's go to the rest of the drums and see if we're doing anything interesting. First thing we're doing here, as usual, is the gain staging. We turn down the level there to give us a decent headroom. Then EQ to carve out space and tame some resonant frequencies. Yeah, I guess I heard something that was annoying my ears, so I had to take them off. And I'm also doing a high pass up to 67 Hz. Again, we're just trying to make sure every instrument within the mix is sitting in its rightful pocket in the frequency range. I'm also doing something very, very fun. I'm doing a send here to my chorus aux track, which contains the doubler from Waves, just to add a bit of width to the drums. If I turn this off, you'd hear the difference that this is actually making to the record. It's actually quite nice. So let's bypass the chorus send. You can hear that the drums just feel like it's right there in the center. And then if we add the send, it just sounds wider. And you can actually even hear the auto panning that the producers did in the first place when they created this record. It just kind of enhanced that. And that sounded really good to me. By the way, this song was produced by Monster Sound and Chich, the producer. Dope producers. So moving on, we're doing the same thing for the rest of the track. Gain staging and EQing where we need to EQ out stuff to carve out space or target resonant frequencies. Right, so this EQ move is something I recently started to do a lot for crash and sometimes hi-hats. Just to tame the high frequencies, because sometimes hi-hats and crash can sound a bit harsh and you don't usually realize it until when you get to your mastering stage. So this actually just helps to just tame that a little bit, and this is a dynamic EQ move as well. I'm going to leave a link up here to my last video on dynamic EQ if you've not seen that. That would help you understand how to actually use the dynamic EQ to your advantage. So what else do we have here? Let's get this one. Again, I'm using the EQ to carve out space, as well as doing some dynamic EQ in here to add some thickness to the low end. I just want to add bass boost to the actual bass notes of the talking drum. We don't get any boost until we actually get to those lower bass notes. So as you can see, It's a very, very nice way to use the EQ to get a clean sound. Because if you just have a static EQ boost here, when you don't have notes playing on this frequency range, you're going to just have a bass boost there that might muddy up the sound a little bit. Do you understand? This is just much cleaner, you know, so you're only enhancing what needs to be enhanced. Again, I'm going to leave a link to the dynamic EQ video if you've not seen that. It's actually quite sick. So that's it for the drums. And typically once I'm done doing all of these for my drums, I would route all the drums to the drum bus where I'll do my glue compression to glue everything together so everything sounds cohesive. As you can see, I've routed all the tracks to the drum bus. And I'm also doing a send here that is going to my parallel drum bus for parallel drum compression. With my drum compression, I like to stay around -1 dB of gain reduction. That's typically more than enough for a nice glue compression. You know, and like I said, we do have the parallel compression bus. Let's see the difference that that's making to the sound, you know, without it and with the parallel compression. Instant life. It's actually quite amazing what you can do with parallel compression. Personally, I prefer to use it on drums, but you can use parallel compression to add more energy to any part of your mix that you think is lacking that energy. It's actually quite sick. So let's move on to the bass. We're starting with gain staging as usual with the trim plugin, and then much needed EQ.
Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts.
So as you can see, I'm doing that low shelf move here as well. Again, I just find that this actually works greatly for bass and kicks essentially. Then we're doing a bit of dynamic EQ in here as well to tame some resonant frequencies, because this bass surprisingly had a lot of resonant frequencies that needed to be tamed. So moving on to the next bass, we have this nice live bass here. Again, the same process, gain staging, and then we have the EQ. I'm also doing the low shelf move here up to 31 heads this time around. Right, and then we have the neutral compressor. And what I'm doing with this is just simply sidechain compression. Sidechain the kick to the bass. So every time the kick hits, the bass will duck. Typical compressor stuff. I'll leave a video here in case you don't know how to set this up in Pro Tools. Pretty much. And then I also have another compressor here, the CLA2A. Typically, I will do my compression in the bass bus to glue tracks together. But if I listen to a particular instrument and I realize I need some more compression, then I will throw in compression directly on that track. For example, this bass has a very big dynamic range. So I needed to reduce the dynamic range so we can have a nice, even sounding performance. I'm going to bypass this compressor so you can hear the difference without the compressor. You can hear that the quiet parts are really, really quiet and the loud parts are just loud. And that will make it difficult for the bass to cut through in the mix, okay? So with the compressor on, right, so we still have the dynamic range, we still have the loud parts, we still have the quiet parts to retain that original feel that the bass player had when he was playing it. But we've greatly reduced the dynamic range so that we can have a much more punchy sound. This is an opto compressor, so it has very slow attack. And I wanted to use this so I can allow some of the transient to cut through. And after all of this is done, I move to the bass bus where I'm doing some more compression. In this case, because we don't have too many bass players at the same time, I'm basically just using the compressor here on the bass bus to do a little bit more compression to even out the performance even some more. Pretty much, all right. And then we have the BX saturator here on the bass bus. I'm using this to add some much needed saturation to the higher bass frequencies so you can have the bass cut through properly in the mix, especially when you listen on your phones and your laptop speakers and stuff like that. So it's just, can you hear that? Right? So just the higher bass frequencies, essentially anywhere from 400 to 1.5K or something like that. So let's move on to the melodies real quick. The process is still the same, but there's also something I'm doing with this intro sample, because there's two of them. I have the first main one here, or what I like to call the main one, and I'm not doing gain staging with this one because the level was great. But then we have the EQ to carve out space and target resonant frequencies, just smoothing out the vocals some more. And I have the CLA2A compressor here to compress the vocal sample as well to even out the performance even some more. Before, after, right, just to give it more presence. And I have two sends, one to the reverb aux track and second one to the delay aux track, you know, just to add some much needed space to the sample. I'm using Lewitt for the reverb and Nectar Delay for the delay. You know, they're both amazing isotope plugins. So like I said, I have this main one combining with this other instance of the same vocal sample. But the main one is louder, and this second track is just kind of serving like a parallel compression type effect. It's not necessary, it's not important, it's just something that I felt like just experimenting with.
Ladies and gentlemen,
You hear the difference when I mute and unmute the tracks there. And then let's move on to the next track. We have a guitar, the same process, gain staging, trim plugin, but there's also something I'm doing here before I hit the EQ, which is noise reduction with the Clarity VX Pro plugin. Because this sample, I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a lot of noise in the sample. Right? Let me take it off. It's probably from the plugin or something they used when they made the beat. And as usual, we're using the EQ to target resonant frequencies. But if you notice, you see I'm doing a combination of both dynamic EQ and static EQ moves here. So I've done a boost here up to 4 dB, just to add a little bit more presence to the guitar. So bypass. And then with the EQ on. You can especially hear the highs shine because of this EQ move that we've done here. Again, all of these EQ moves are obviously based on what I believe the record needs. So that's the reason why everybody will tell you to use your ear when you're mixing. The more you mix songs, the more experience you get, the more you kind of know what stuff needs. So let's proceed. I'm doing the same thing for the rest of the tracks, as you can see here. This other track also had a lot of noise, so I used the Clarity VX here as well. Yeah. Bro, the noise here, man. That's crazy. So what else are we doing here? I'm using this volume trim automation here to automate the level of this flute. Because on this first part of the record, it's quiet. But yeah, it's really loud, as you can tell from the waveform, right? So I'm using this volume trim automation to adjust that. I actually really love the volume trim in Pro Tools because when you do a volume trim automation, you can adjust the level of the track and you just move along with the automation, which is actually quite nice, right? So instead of doing normal volume automation and then you are stuck with not being able to move things around, you can just automate wherever you want to automate with the volume trim, and as you can see, you can still adjust it. I like to use the loop that you can see. I've used it for this particular track as well.
ladies and gentlemen,
Right, so this is First Class's tag.
ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts.
Just to make sure it's not clashing with this vocal sample, you know, I've toned it down and I also panned it to the right, which means I have automation there as well, as you can see. Yeah, that's the pan automation.
Ladies and gentlemen,
So that's it for the instrumental. Like I said, the process is typically the same. I gain stage where I need to gain stage. I use my EQ to carve out space where I need to carve out space. But when the track needs something else, like in this case, noise reduction, because the instruments had noise, then I will use the appropriate plugin. Or I feel like the track also needs some more compression, then I would compress the track. So typically I don't compress individual tracks because most samples are already compressed. And the producers will typically bounce the beats with compression as well. The only time I would compress instrumentals is when it's a live recording, because you need to compress your snares, a kick, again, live recording. But for digital stuff like these beats and whatnot, I don't compress stuff except they really need to. And speaking of live, the bass guitar was recorded live, so you see, needed compression. You understand? So that's how I do it, okay? So let's move on to the vocals real quick. That stutter effect you just listened to is what I do for radio edits most times. I like to alternate between that and maybe slow down effect. So for the vocals, my process is trim plugin to set our levels. I think in this case I actually added gain because the vocals are a little bit quiet. And then that's usually followed by the pitch correction plugin. I'm using WaveTune for this record. And then I do the rest of the vocal processing in the vocal bus. However, sometimes I might listen to the vocals and realize that it needs some extra, maybe EQing and stuff. And then I will do it on the track itself after I've done my processing on the bus. I say that because if you look at this very track, you can see that I have the Kirchhoff EQ and I'm doing some dynamic EQ in around 107 and 205 Hz to control that low frequency a little bit more. Right? Right, just to smoothen it up, okay? If I bypass that, do you hear the difference? You know, it felt like we have too much bass on the vocals. You You know, this made it a little bit more smoother. And another reason why I did that for this record, because I could have actually come here to do the same EQ move somewhere around here and probably would have gotten the same result. But the reason I did that on the track itself is because I am running two different artists through this vocal chain, both Jerick and First Class going through the lead vocal box. So this EQ needed to be done specifically on First Class's vocals because he's the one that needed that attention to the lower frequencies.
I fell in love with the dollar.
You can hear that Jerick sounded very, very nice with just the processing in the vocal bus. And another way I would differentiate two different artists if I'm running them through the same vocal bus would also be through reverb and delay automation. In this case though, I'm not doing that because they both sounded great with the same delay and reverb setting. Mixing is all about being dynamic with your decisions and making sure you do what's needed for the track. All right, let's quickly walk through the vocal chain as usual.
I fell in love with the dollar.
Oh, there's something I failed to mention before we go into the vocal chain. On the melody bus, I did some more processing, you know, because I felt like I was still hearing some more resonant frequencies. So I used the catch-off EQ to target some more of that resonant frequencies. You know, just cleaning up what I felt was still present in the melody mix at the end of the day. And then after that, I moved to compression. I typically like to do EQ before compression actually, because when you EQ before compressing, you are compressing a much more cleaner signal. And then I also use the waves curve EQ to generate an EQ curve that I think works for the melody mix. Let's bypass this so you can hear the difference. Bypass. And then with it. You know, it just made it a bit brighter and gave it more definition. Although some of that noise came back, but you know, you can't necessarily hear it in the mix, so I didn't bother with it. Right, you can't hear the noise in the mix, you know, but it's there. Let's go to the vocals real quick. At the top of the vocal chain, we have the Clarity VX Pro to target noise. But I also like to go into the advanced controls, set my crossover point at 10K and up to target some very, very harsh frequencies that are in the vocals. Something like this. I don't know, you can hear it, those very, very sharp high frequencies. You know, this is a very good way to tame them before I even proceed down the vocal chain. What's next? We have the catch-off EQ to target resonant frequencies. And this is why I love dynamic EQ. Even though we have all of these multiple points here, we are not affecting the vocals at the same time. We're only affecting the vocals when they exceed the threshold that I set.
I fell in love with the dollar.
It's just so beautiful to work with. And then we have the Nectar DS to target sibilance. You know, when we get to shh, you can see the ESR acting there. And then we have the SSLE channel strip. This is my favorite EQ for vocals. This is where I start to shape the tone of the vocal, as you can see. My setting is usually the same for most records that I work, because at this setting, you get a very, very nice professional sounding vocals. So what I do mostly is just adjust the highs and the lows, and sometimes the low mid, but typically I always stay around this same range. For example, I'm doing a cut up to, we can say -3 around 200 hertz here. Some songs I will do deeper cuts, but I wanted to retain the deepness in their vocals. That's why we're not doing too much here. And if I'm trying to really duck the vocal into the beat, I'll just increase the bell shape on the low mid frequencies, and that will just really tuck in the vocals into the beat. Just simple stuff like that. If you want to get a great sounding vocal like me, if you want something that can quickly help you achieve great sounding vocals, I'm going to leave a link below to my store so you can get some of my vocal preset. And what you get in the vocal preset is my exact mixing philosophy. And after the SSLE, we hit the first compressor. I like to compress in series, and I'm using the 1176 compressor to just tame picks.
I fell in love with it.
You know, sometimes even barely moving the needle. The setting is actually quite simple. This is the revision AE version of this 1176 compressor, and this has the slow mode, which makes the attack even slower. But sometimes when I want a faster attack, then I'll just move this around to get a faster attack. Like if I did that now, you can see the needle moving there. But to be honest, what I really use this for in this record is for amplification, because I push the outputs of the 1176 to get the vocals really loud, sort of like using the 1176 like an input to feed the LA2A to get the amount of compression that I needed. Essentially. But before we jump to the LA2, after the 1176, we have the C6 multiband compressor. This is where I really get to shape the tone of the vocals. I'm going to leave a link here on how to do this from scratch, but this is quite amazing. I've set this up in a way where I can use 10K and up to add air to the vocals. I can use 1.3K to 10K to control the clarity of the vocals, and use 91 Hz to 1.3K to control the low mids. Okay, and I just roll off everything below 91 Hz because I don't need that. I also like to set the behavior of the C6 to opto, so it behaves like an opto compressor, so it's much more smoother. And then after the C6, we have the LA2A. This is where I do the main compression of the vocals. I use this to even out the performance of the vocals some more. And then the last plugin on the vocal chain is the SPL DSR. I love this DSR a lot because it's very smooth on highs. I always use this to just smoothen up the high frequencies in the vocals and also to control the brightness. For example, if the artist say, listen man, I want my vocals to be bright, I'll just reduce the S reduction.
I fell in love with the dollar.
If they want to be warmer, then I increase the S reduction. It's actually quite sick. I've set this to auto threshold, and I've also activated mid and side processing at the same time. So that's that. Let's look at Jerry's background vocals real quick.
I fell in love with the dollar.
So again, the same process. I have the trim plugin, I have the auto tune plugin, and then the rest of the processing is happening on the background vocal chain. But I have my routing set up like this. I have the background vocals routed to the background vocal summing bus, which is this guy here, and the background vocal summing bus is feeding the background vocal bus. And that's because in the background summing aux track, I have this multi-band compressor here, and I'm compressing signals from 3K to 7K. Yeah, that's it. Just to ensure that the background vocals will constantly sit below the lead vocals.
I fell in love with the dollar.
Right, it's actually quite nice. And then the plugin for the background vocals is typically the same, as you can see. The only difference is I would obviously set the C6, the
I fell in love with the dollar.
You can see that I'm actually not even compressing the background vocals on this record. The needle is not moving. I'm just using this for amplification. This is my personal pro tip. Sometimes you can just use the 1176 compressor and the LA2A compressor as amplification tools to make your vocals loud, just like that. These plugins are modeled after analog compressors, so their sound is different from full-on digital compressors. There's saturation built into them, so just running your vocal through them sometimes can add saturation to your vocals. There you go. And that's also why I don't bother to use saturation in my vocal chain. Prefer to just do that when I'm mastering. I actually forgot to mention the time-based effect for the lead vocals. Well, we have the room reverb that's feeding the pure plate, very short reverb, the main reverb, and that's H reverb, my favorite for lead vocals. And then we have stereo delay, and that's going to my comeback key. The background vocal is a little bit different. We have the same room reverb. We have the very big reverb, which is feeding both the Valhalla vintage verb and the new verb. I'm blending both the new verb and the Valhalla vintage verb, as you can see here. Again, not necessary, it's just something that I like. And then we have delay, which is going to the nectar delay. So I think I've set this to 8 note here and quarter note here to just create that ping pong effect. If you listen,
I fell in love with it.
Then we have a chorus effect to just widen up the background vocals a little bit more, and that's feeding my doubler on the chorus effects aux track as well. Right, so we have this whole crowd singing for this part of the record. And I use the doubler on this particular track just to widen up the crowd a little bit. Right, rather than this. You know, just. You know, it's actually quite nice. Again, remember that you must set the levels of your tracks when you're mixing. So even after you've done gain staging, you still have to balance your levels out, right? You still have to decide which track is going to be loud and which track is not going to be loud. And then we have Zlatan's verse, if I forget.
Them they set jam. Emi mefa. Seke bula.
Right, so Zlatan's verse is going to a separate aux track Z. I've decided to do a different aux track for Zlatan because, as you can see, his performance is totally different. He's singing on the higher notes. It's not like Jerick and First Class are singing on lower octaves. He's like way out there. So different textures, totally different textures. That's why I'm using totally different vocal bus for Zlatan, as you can see. So again, the process is still the same. We have the Clarity VX Pro, we have the EQ to target resonant frequencies, DSR, we have the SSL E-channel strip. But this time around, as you can see, I'm actually not doing a lot of cuts to the low frequencies on his vocals because he needs the low frequencies.
Them they set jam.
And I'm also not adding any high frequencies to his vocals with the SSL channel strip because his vocals are already very sharp. And then what else are we doing with the C6? Let's see. Right, so the same thing with the C6. I've significantly dropped the high frequencies on the C6. But I'm using the same time base effects, as you can see. The same room reverb, the same main reverb, and the same delay, you know, basically. I'm also using the same background vocal bus for Zlatan's vocals as well, as you can see. So that's that for the whole song, man. That's everything I've done for the mix. Let's just walk through the mastering chain real quick. So my mastering chain is very straightforward. We have the V emitter at the very top, you know. You know, to monitor our levels, make sure we're getting good levels before we hit the chain. And then we have the ozone. Within the ozone, I have 3 plugins, if you call it that. You know, we have the first EQ to target resonant frequencies. Basically, the last cleanup process for the entire record. And then we have another EQ. I like to always do the 60 Hz 1 dB boost on every track I work on. I think it always gives the low frequency a nice thickness, you know, something like that. And then we have the imager. I really love the ozone imager because you have the option of creating crossover points, so you can get to do your stereo widening in frequency ranges essentially. And then we have the SPL PQ. This is my favorite EQ for mastering. This is where I get to shape the tone of the entire record. I'm doing a boost up to 4 dB around 61 Hz for this record. I'm doing a cut up to 1 dB around 205 Hz. I'm now doing into the mid frequencies, and for the high mid frequencies, I'm doing a 1 dB boost around 2.6K. Alright, and then for the high frequencies, I'm doing a 2 dB boost around 18 kHz just to add brightness to the entire record. And then we have the SPL ion. This is where I get to glue the entire track together. Typically, the aim again is 1 dB of gain reduction. So very simple, slow attack, fast release because it's mastering. And then I like the air bass on this plugin. It really does make the low end sound really, really thick. So without it, I mean, it's nice, but with it on,
my break only go feel my jam.
you know, that thickness there. And we have the high power sidechain filter. So I've set that to 90 Hz so that the compressor is reacting to all of the signals above 90 Hz. That way we can have a little bit more even compression across the entire song. And then we have the mono maker, and I've set that to 80 Hz, which means I've made everything below 80 Hz mono. Again, just to make sure we have a very, very tight and solid low end. We have the black box saturator to add saturation. Now, based on how I mix, I like to set this to flat, so that way I have saturation going across the entire frequency range. And my saturation is 50, going to the pentode 50, which is also feeding the triode at 50, and the mix is also set to 50. So I'm doing parallel processing with this saturator. It's actually quite nice. And then I have the air just to add a little bit more brightness to the entire song. Let's bypass this so we can hear the difference. So without it, and with it, it just immediately makes the song sound finished, which is great. And then we have the BX clipper. As you can see, I like to use this to clip the entire record before I go into limiting, so I don't have to do heavy limiting. And when you clip before you get to limit, you get a much louder sounding master at the end of the day. Typically, I don't do more than 2 dB when I'm clipping, but for this record, as you can see, I'm doing quite a lot.
My break only go feel my jam.
Just above minus 3.4 dB of reduction there actually, but it worked for the record, so I just did not bother myself with that. But again, doing that will make sure I don't have to do heavy limiting. Let's go to the newfangled audio limiter. This is where I'm doing my limiting. Right. You know, I'm staying around minus 4 dB of gain reduction. I've set my true peak on, set my transient emphasis to 70%, you know, and that is giving us
my break only go feel my jam. Just re-enter one chance. Since the boy boss out.
Right, so around minus 7 dB LUFS, as you can see, and true peak of minus 5 dB. I'm able to achieve this true peak because we have the true peak limiting turned on the newfangled Elevate plugin. And once you do that, you can use your ceiling to set your true peak level. If I set this to minus 1 dB, my true peak automatically becomes minus 1 dB. So yeah, man, that's everything we've done from this record, and I hope you got something from this. And if you did, make sure you leave me a like and subscribe to the channel if you've not. And again, if you'd like to buy my vocal mastering preset, I'm going to leave a link below to my seller store where you can get my presets. And if you'd like to book my services for mixing and mastering, I'm going to leave a link below to the engineers page, or you can hit me up on Instagram at Benny Macaulay DB. I'm going to leave a link to this song in the description of this video as well, so you guys can check the record out. Alright, so that's going to be for now. I shall see you on the next one. Benny Macaulay out.
What for me don't get me? Them they set jam. Emi mefa. Seke bula. Okada no get reverse. My break only go feel my jam. Just re-enter one chance. Since the boy boss up.